This is Cuba, an island nation at the center of the Caribbean, sometimes called the Pearl of the Antilles. It has an expansive history due to colonization. In 1492, Columbus found the island we know as Cuba, calling it Isla Juana. Thinking he had landed in India, the indigenous inhabitants were called Indians. At the time of discovery, there were three distinct cultures on the island: the Guanahabe, the Siboney, and the Taíno, or Arawak people. Looking for gold, he was disappointed to find there was none, but this was prime land for cash crops such as sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton. The first settlement was founded in 1511. The natives were enslaved and forced to work on the plantations. By the end of the century, almost all the original inhabitants were wiped out due to diseases such as smallpox, measles, and typhus, made worse by poor living conditions, along with terrible working conditions. For the next 200 years, the settlements in Cuba developed poorly due to mismanagement, corruption, and Spanish emphasis on building urban environments. In 1754, the 7 Years' War developed into a conflict with the British versus the Spanish and the French. Britain occupied Cuba, immediately opening trade with its North American colonies, changing Cuban society by importing horses, tools, and other goods, along with tens of thousands of African slaves. In 1762, a deal was finalized. Spain got to keep the island in exchange for Florida, ending the 7 Years' War. In 1868, an uprising was led by Carlos Manuel de Cespedes. When Carlos had freed his slaves, he led an uprising throughout Cuba. The Spanish fought hard for the island, killing many rebels, but ultimately they had to concede, with the Pact of Zanjan, signed on February 10, 1878, bringing an end to the war. Although some rebels didn't agree with the terms, it was too late, and despite their protests, Spanish rule returned to the island. America had been funding insurgents to overthrow the Spanish. As a response, the new governor of Cuba, General Valerio Weyler, rounded up the rebels, putting some 300,000 in concentration camps. The quality of life in these camps were terrible, leading to the deaths of tens of thousands of Cubans. The U.S. launched a propaganda campaign with a series of newspapers calling for intervention and labeling Weyler as a butcher. In January of 1898, riots broke out in Havana when pro-Spanish Cubans burned the newspapers criticizing Weyler. Fearing attacks on Americans living in Cuba, the U.S. sent a battleship called the USS Maine to protect them. On February 15, 1898, the USS Maine exploded in the Cuban port of Havana. Although the cause of the explosion wasn't determined, the Spanish were blamed. On April 11, 1898, a joint resolution was pitched to Congress, rejecting any attempt to annex Cuba. The resolution demanded Spain withdraw its troops and giving President McKinley the power to use military force. The resolution was passed, and these demands were sent to Spain. They were rejected. On April 25th, the U.S. was now at war with Spain. In June, the American Army landed on Cuba, starting a months-long ground campaign while the Navy captured the port of Guantanamo Bay. On August 12th, Spain negotiated an end to the war. In the Treaty of Paris, the U.S. gained the territories of the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and making Cuba a protectorate. Cuba gained formal independence from the U.S. on the 20th of May, 1902, becoming the Republic of Cuba. Under U.S. rule, the Cuban Constitution was created, allowing America to control its finances and foreign relations, along with the right to intervene in affairs. In 1924, General Machado was elected president. During his administration, tourism boomed, and the construction of American-owned businesses, hotels, and resorts were completed. After the Wall Street crash, the price of sugar went down, and political unrest occurred. Students known as the Generation of 1930 turned to violence against the unpopular Machado. This led to an uprising of the sugar workers and an army revolt that forced Machado to exile. In August 1933, after Machado had left, he was replaced by Carlos Manuel de Cespedes Huequeza. Less than a month later, in 1933, the Sergeant Revolt occurred. Led by Fulgencio Batista, he overthrew de Cespedes. In 1940, Batista was elected president. His first act was to ban the Communist Party. Cuba was in a period of economic decline due to strict regulations imposed by the new government. Brutal suppression of suspected communists occurred during this time, and wealth was reallocated to the members of the Nationalist Party. In 1956, Fidel Castro and about 80 supporters landed on Cuba in an attempt to start a rebellion against the Batista government. You know what time it is? It's total communist takeover time, baby!
Que con combatientes cubanos podrá contar el movimiento revolucionario en cualquier rincón de la tierra.
Oligarquía de cada uno de los países para impedir el triunfo democrático de la revolución.
Castro, leader of the successful revolution and still a hero to most of his people.
La revolución no será una pelea fácil. La revolución será una empresa dura y llena de inicial. ¿En qué mejor lugar para establecer el gobierno de la República en esta fortaleza de la revolución?
Por lo menos en las condiciones de nuestro país, no había otro camino. No hay otro camino que la lucha armada.
Así entendemos los revolucionarios cubanos. Así entiende nuestro pueblo sus deberes. Porque entiende que el enemigo es uno. El mismo que nos ataca a nosotros, mismo que ataca a los demás.
La lucha armada es el único camino para la liberación.
By late 1958, the rebels had launched a general insurrection. After Castro's fighters captured Santa Clara, Batista fled with his family to the Dominican Republic. In 1959, Castro took control of the country. His first act was to legalize the Communist Party and execute hundreds of Batista supporters. Later that year, the Agrarian Reform Law was passed, seizing thousands of acres of farmland for the Communists. This upset the U.S., and so they blocked all trade with Cuba and froze Cuban overseas assets. America, seeing a communist regimes being set up in their backyard, approved a CIA plan for arming and training a group of Cuban refugees to overthrow the Castro government. On April 14, 1961, about 1,400 Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs. To hide U.S. involvement, air support was scaled back, causing Cuban troops and local militias to defeat the invading forces, killing over 100 invaders and taking the remainder prisoner. In 1962, American generals proposed Operation Northwoods, which would entail committing terrorist attacks in American cities against American refugees and blaming these attacks on the U.S. government, giving the U.S. a reason to invade Cuba. Now, I know what you're thinking. The U.S. would never attack its own citizens. And you're right. Anyway, this plan was rejected by President Kennedy because it was insane. The Cuban Missile Crisis, or the October Crisis, was a 13-day confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. An American U-2 spy plane took clear photographic evidence of the Soviet missiles on the island. When this was reported to Kennedy, he created a National Security Council called the XCOM. The council suggested a preemptive strike, destroying the weapons, but Kennedy opted for a naval quarantine, as a blockade would be a declaration of war. The U.S. announced that it would not permit any weapons to be delivered to Cuba, and all ships entering would be searched. On the morning of October 27th, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Cuban airspace. It was also reported that the Soviet missiles were ready for operation, escalating the conflict even further. Later that day, the U.S. dropped death charges on the Soviet submarine. As the submarine was too deep to monitor any radio traffic, the captain of the sub believed that the war might have already started, and wanted to launch a nuclear torpedo. However, this man was aboard, and he also had a degree. He didn't, so the launch never occurred, saving the world from nuclear Armageddon. Later that same day, the U.S. started drafting up a plan for a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Mere hours before this plan was going into effect, Kennedy secretly agreed to remove all missiles in Turkey and southern Italy. The Soviet Union, in exchange, would remove all missiles in Cuba. During the Cold War, Cuban forces were deployed across Africa as military advisors and combatants. In 1963, Cuba sent 686 troops, together with 22 tanks and other military equipment, to support Algeria in the Sand War against Morocco. Che Guevara engaged in guerrilla warfare across Africa. He was captured and executed in 1967 while attempting to start a revolution in Bolivia. During the 1970s, Fidel Castro sent tens of thousands of troops to support Soviet-backed wars in Africa. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Cuba faced severe economic downturn in the 90s. The Soviet Union had provided Cuba with large amounts of oil, food, and machinery. The years after the collapse, Cuba's GDP shrunk more than 35%. Imports and exports fell by over 80%. Many industries were shut down, leading to a time known as the Special Period. In 2008, Fidel handed the presidency to his brother Raúl Castro. Raúl stepped down in 2018. Now Miguel Diaz is the current president of Cuba. Colonialism had led to the displacement and deaths of hundreds of millions of people globally. Cuba is the perfect example about how resentments can create an atmosphere of never-ending rebellion against the powers that be, whether it be Spanish, British, Americans, or the communists. Raging against those who take away your freedoms has become embedded into Cuban culture. If you ever get a chance, watch the Cuba Libre story on Netflix. It's one of the best documentaries I've seen while researching this, going into detail of the oppression on all sides, painting a clear picture of Cubans' struggle for independence. I leave you with a quote from Fidel Castro. "A revolution is not a bed of roses. A revolution is a struggle between the future and the past."